waiting and ready to be scanned. On the Kennedale newspaper digitization project, just as of this past Saturday, I delivered the first 4 years, 1965 through 1968, to Dr. Kramer at UNT, and she's going to do a trial scan for us because we have to have some parameters for the grant to be able to show an interest. Because the newspapers are so fragile and they're flaking apart, we haven't been able to allow anybody to look at them at the library here. So once we actually get some online, we can have some numbers to show that people are interested in seeing these. So once they get put on the portal of Texas History, probably by the end of the year, we will send out the link, and we need everybody to go and look 3 times a day. Well, it doesn't have a light, but they can tell when you're looking at it. So they'll keep track of all of that, and we'll include that in our grant, and that'll help us get the rest of the newspaper digitization project funded. Not only will that do the remaining years of the physical newspaper, but they're talking about having us be their guinea pig to preserve the Kennedale News website, which is going to be a first for them. And also they're talking about doing our photo work from the Kennedale News, so that'll be really good. Just a reminder to check out our website. It's Kennedale Historical Society 2011.wordpress.com. You can find information about how to join as a member. It's about that time of year to renew memberships. Thank you to y'all for rejoining today. There's forms over here at the table afterwards. It's $10. $10 for the year, and the funds help us to do things like these projects we're doing. We have to have binders and sheet protectors to organize the photo more to be digitized, and we have to pay for shipping for the yearbooks and things like that. We have a number of expenditures, but this is also where you can go and find the yearbooks that are already online and find more information about our newspaper project. This is our YouTube channel. Be sure to check that out. Each month we record the speakers and put them online afterwards. So if you miss a month, you can go back and see it, and it's a great resource. Next month in October, we've got Dr. Ron Tyler, and he's going to talk about his new book, Texas Lithographs, A Century of History and Images. And this is it. So if you want to look at that before you leave, be sure to come and see that next month.
You know that it says October 19th on the flyer that you all have online. Whoa.
We'll double check that.
Because I was going to ask, is it actually the 19th? Because that would
It's always the third Thursday.
Okay, well, that's what it was. Good catch.
November and December, we're not going to have any meetings. Happy Thanksgiving, Merry Christmas. But in November, on the 10th, we are going to have the Kennedale Historical Marker unveiling at 3 p.m. So be sure to come and see that.
For the Methodist Church.
Yes. In January, we're going to take a trip to the UT Arlington Special Collections Library. For this, we need an RSVP because we're going to try to possibly take a Kennedale school bus so we can all meet here and then drive together to UTA. And they're going to pull all kinds of interesting items from the archive for us to see. They have some really interesting things from the original pictures from the Roswell UFO pictures from the Star Telegram collection to an original copy of the Texas Declaration of Independence. And as a local interest, they have the papers of Oliver S. Kennedy, the founder of Kennedale. So I'll have them pull those and we'll get to see
But
that.
this is not the Gray Island. That's not from AI, he really is the founder.
Right.
So
So
that's
that's,
why you're young, when you researched it on AI. and
no,
It's
no.
not AI. It's not AI. It's really true.
So if you just email your RSVP to kenhist@live.com, so that we can plan on you coming and have space on our bus. February and March are to be determined. We don't have any plans yet, but in April, we're going to have Dr. Thomas O. McDonald. He's the author of Texas Rangers, Ranchers, and Realtors. And that book is over here as well, if you'd like to take a look at it before you leave. It's another great book. It'll be a very interesting presentation. And without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Sam W. Haynes. He's going to talk about his new book, Unsettled Land, From Revolution to Republic, The Struggle for Texas. And he is the director for Southwest Studies
Greater Southwestern Studies.
at UTA. Has been a professor there for a long time. He's my former professor. I had him for an online history course, and I think it'd be good for the whole UT system.
I think they do. Yeah, it's offered elsewhere.
And and I had him for Images of the American West, which was one of my favorite classes. So I will turn it over to Sam.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's nice to be back. I used to live just off of Little Road about 6 or 7 years ago. I sold the house. Now I live in the house. So it's great. It's great to be back. And also, I want to give a plug for Tom's book. Tom, I know Ron. And Ron's Texas lithographs. Actually, both of those books, they have worked on them, Ron and Tom, for decades. So they are labors of love. They are terrific books. Both of them have won prizes. So I would be remiss if I didn't plug for both of these. And since Devin mentioned special collections and Roswell UFOs, as the director of the Center for Greater Southwestern Studies, we are having an old friend of mine, Tom, he's written a book, After the Flying Saucers Came. And I'll send you the link if you want to get in touch with Haynes at uta.edu. He's speaking October 3rd at 12:30. And it's a great new book on UFOs. So, and I think I'm going to have Evan Spencer put out some of those photos, and I think they'll still be around. If we're coming on the 19th, did you say? Okay.
January.
No, this is October.
No.
Oh, January is the Speaker tour. They may not be out. Okay. They may have put them away. But we are doing an event on UFOs in like 2 weeks, October 3rd. Okay, so my book is called Unsettled Land, From Revolution to Republic, Struggle for Texas. And when I pitched the book to the publisher in New York, I said, there's a lot going on in Texas during this period, early decades of the 19th century, than the Alamo and San Jacinto, more than Sam Houston, more than Stephen F. Austin. And they said, great, we didn't know that. Write that book. So I did, and just to give you an idea of how the Alamo has dominated this narrative, I sent the manuscript off after working on the book for maybe 3 years, and I got an email one Friday afternoon from my editor, and it had a PDF attachment, and it said, here is your artwork for the book, we hope you like it. And I clicked on the PDF, and it was, to my horror, it was an image of the Alamo with smoke rising from the walls. And I said, look, this is what I'm writing about. I do talk about the Alamo. I don't talk about it much. But it has to share the stage with all of these other events in Texas history, which I think are important. So they went back to the drawing board, and I shouldn't make fun of Basics art department, because I really like the way. Their second attempt I liked a lot, but the first one was a disaster. Because it's not about the Alamo, and it's not about Austin. And Houston, although of course they figure properly in the pages of this book, First thing that I ask them, I tell them to do, take out a piece of paper, write down 3 historical figures. Always the same people. It's Sam Houston, Stephen Boston, maybe it's David Crockett. You know? Last year, a kid wrote Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I said, all right, we're going to get along anyway. But it's always those 3 people. And this is a narrative which has been told and retold over and over and over again. And when I talked to my editor at Basic, I said, look, half the people in Texas are people of color. And so, you can ignore those people if you want, or you can talk about them. And so I talk about them in my book, and I try to give a more balanced view of this period of Texas history. Again, that's not to say that Sam Houston disappears. I talk about Sam Houston a lot. Austin I talk about too, but I'll tell you I have a somewhat different take, and I'll explain that in just a second when I get into my talk. But I just wanted to tell the story of all of the people of Texas, and it's such a complicated story. And so if you remember your Texas history from 7th grade, and who doesn't? I mean, really. For some reason, when you're in 7th grade, you're an impressionable period. I mean, everybody remembers their Texas history class, their teacher. It's a complicated story. It is so much more complicated. There's so much more going on than just the story of Austin and the old 300, Idol of Sam Houston, the Texas Rebellion. And so that's the story that I wanted to tell. And so I thought what I would do tonight is tell a story, because it's a long book, 400 pages. I talk about a lot of things, but I'm just going to talk about one thing, and it's a narrative which runs throughout the book. It's a narrative thread that runs throughout the book. But, boy, I think you have to be reading the book really carefully to follow this narrative, because there's so many other things going on. So, but I want to talk about the quest for a Cherokee homeland tonight. And I'm going to just talk about the Cherokees. I can talk about the Alamo. I'll be happy to talk about the Alamo if there's a Q&A if you want. Sanchez says so too. I'll talk about all those things. But tonight, I'm just going to talk about the Cherokees. And so, if you know anything about Texas history, you know that this story is not going to have a happy ending. The quest for Cherokee homeland. There is not a Cherokee homeland in Texas. There's a Cherokee County. And if you go to Cherokee County, as I have many times, you'll see that there's Cherokee Insurance Company, Cherokee Donuts, and Cherokee, and everything's named after the Cherokees. The football team in Jacksonville, it's called the Tribe. There's one thing that you won't see in Cherokee County. You know what that is? Cherokees. You won't see it in Cherokees at all. And so that's the story that I'm going to tell tonight. Okay? And before I do, let me just say that this is obviously not a happy story. It does not end well for the Cherokees. But I'm not a historian who dwells too much, I think, on victimization. The Cherokees do get a raw deal in Texas. This is not a happy story. But I mean, other times, the Cherokees were quite aggressive and violent toward their neighbors. And if you read the book, you've seen the movie Killers of the Flower Moon. Cherokees were at the Osage and the Cherokees were at each other's throats for years when they were in home. And so I'm going to tell a story that is obviously very sympathetic to the Cherokees, but I just want to say that if there was an Osage here tonight for my talk, he or she might say, really? Are we talking about the same people? So I just think it's important to sort of get that out of the way. This does not end well for the Cherokees. The Cherokees need to be understood, they need to be seen not in a romantic way or an idealized way, but for who they were. Okay? That's the story that I want to tell. Let me just start by saying, oops, we should have seen the quote. Let me say something by way of introduction about the Native Americans in Texas. There are a lot of them, and if you think you know something about Native Americans, well, it's complicated. And I know that I taught 7th grade history in another life when I was in grad school, and the start of my career. And we spent a day or two talking about Native American folkways. That was it. And then Stephen Austin came. And then when we talked about Indians, it was because they got in the way of Anglo-Americans. That's the only time it came up. And so there are a lot of Native Americans in Texas. And these are just the people who are there in by the end of the 1700s. I use the term indigenous in a very narrow sense. I'm something of a stickler for this. I had a graduate student who did a dissertation on the Comanches, and he offended 3 months ago, and I said, I'm not letting you call these people indigenous because they are not indigenous to Texas. They came from the Colorado Rocky Mountains. Of these peoples, which tribes are indigenous? Well, Pueblos are, Kennedales are. We think the Coroncos are, the Cuiltecans are. But the other tribes, they came later, and it's important to understand that. And it's also important to understand that these really aren't tribes. We have this really simplistic notion about what a tribe is. These are really tribal bands. So the Pueblos didn't call themselves Pueblos. It's a Spanish term. The Spanish term. The Opis, Sunnis, the Wichitas. Don't get me started on the Wichitas. I mean, there are Talavaya Wichitas in this area, in the Metroplex, in the 1700s and early 1800s. But then there are Tawakanis and Wacos down in the Waco area. And there are others too. There are so many tribal bands which come under, which fit these labels. And it's, when I try to teach Native Americans in Texas to my students, I try to tell them, look, it's complicated. You're never really going to understand this because there's just so much to learn. You spend an entire semester on the Native Americans of Texas. And one more thing, I guess, by way of illustration. They are different, they're culturally dissimilar because they come from from across the continent. Colorado Rockies, Comanches, the Southwest, the Apaches, the Wichita Indians came from Kansas. And they all sort of moved into this region. And it would be naive to think that they had similar folkways because they don't. They couldn't speak to each other. And in my book, I do talk about a meeting, a terrific meeting, during the Houston administration near Waco, where Houston pulled off an amazing feat to get all the tribes to come. And maybe you've heard of the Treaty Birds Fort. This is more, which is up in Arlington. This is more important than that because the Comanches didn't want to come to any of these meetings, so they came to the one in the fall of 1844 near Waco. And we have great notes from that event. And one of the things that really impressed me when I was writing that part of the book was that all of these Indians could not communicate with one another. They didn't speak a common language. There was no lingua franca. So some of them spoke to each other in pidgin Spanish. Some of them spoke to each other in pidgin English. And then when that failed, then they spoke to each other in sign language. So anyone who thinks, so when we use terms like Indian, and I do, just for the sake of simplicity, really. But it's not a useful term, quite frankly, because these are different peoples. And if you took a European history course, say at UTA, your professor said, well, the Europeans did this and the Europeans did that, you might want to think, well, really? What about when you're talking the French and the English and the Germans and the Italians? Native American groups have very little in common with each other, to a far greater degree than said the Europeans, who at least had a root language, which was Latin, a belief system, which was Christianity. All of these tribes, these are micro-societies, and they need to be understood on their own terms. So, I guess you get the idea. I don't want to belabor this. Studying Native Americans is hard. Okay? There's a lot to it. So I wanted to at least get into that story to some degree in my book. But I'm not even finished with the Native Americans. Texas because more come. More are arriving in the early 1800s. And we don't think of these peoples as separate from tribes that I've mentioned, and yet they are. They are newcomers. They come in the early 1800s. Let's hope this math works. The Alabama Coshada, there were two tribes that came together. They may have come to Texas as far as we know in the early 1800s. The early 1800s, before the War of 1812. And they go, so just north of the Beaumont there, in the big thing. The Cherokees, well, we're talking about tonight, they move into the area north of Nacogdoches. The Shawnees, Delawares, and Kickapoo are in the west. They go to, well, that area goes a little bit further south, but they're just south of the Red River, Burnett, that area. Okay. Choctaws and Chickasaws come from Mississippi and Alabama. They go to the Nacogdoches area as well. You get the general idea. In addition to all of those tribes that I just mentioned and showed on that earlier slide, you have new Native Americans in I call them the immigrant tribes. That's what most people call them. And you should see them separate from the peoples that I've mentioned before. Now, if you remember anything about U.S. history, you've heard of the Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears is in the winter of 38-39. Cherokees and other tribes were forcibly removed and were sent into across the Mississippi, and great hardship and loss of life. Cherokees are coming long before 1838. I think that's really important to understand. And they get here before Stephen and Austin. So do the Alabamas and the Coshadas. You don't know enough about them. So when I open the book, chapter 1, I talk about a village, and they're packing up to leave, and they're from western North Carolina. And initially, in the first two paragraphs, you think, okay, these are just your average settlers going off into the frontier. But you don't realize until, I don't know what it is, the second page, the third page, that in fact, these are not Anglo-American settlers. These are Native Americans who have decided on their own, have not been forced, on their own, have decided to move west. So I follow this Cherokee village on its long journey that ultimately leads them to Texas. Okay. They leave in 1811.
You said that they didn't call themselves Cherokees or Wichita's. Did they have a name?
Oh, the Cherokee language was unique to the Cherokees.
Did they call themselves?
I think the Cherokees did.
The Cherokees.
I think the Cherokees did, but I may be wrong. Cherokees have a language. One of the things that we find for a lot of tribes is that the names that they were given were often the names that other tribes gave them. Okay. Comanches did not call themselves Comanches. Entirely different word for who they were. But the Cherokees are similar, not identical, similar to Anglo-American settlers of the 18th century. They lived in log cabins. They had adapted to Western practices like weaving and things like that. Many Cherokees sort of looked like Anglo-Americans on the frontier. Pictures, we have great pictures of Native Americans in the early 1800s. The watercolor in the middle, or on my right, is a set of fantastic watercolors of Native Americans done by a Spanish artist in the early 1800s. But I want to talk about this guy, Chief Bowles, who's sometimes called Duwali. I don't actually call him that, for reasons I probably don't need to get into here. He was known by everyone, and even by some Cherokees, as Bowles, and so that's the name that I use in my book. This image, I want to caution you, is an image that you will see in every single Texas history textbook. It's in my book, who knows what he looks like. This was a 20th century rendering. You might as well just call this old man in a hat, because I don't know what Bowles looked like. I thought about not using the image, but I thought it's so widely accepted, I guess I would go ahead. But we don't know. But we know he's in his 60s when he moves out of western North Carolina. He had neither the hair nor the eyes of an Indian. His eyes were gray, and his hair was of a dirty sandy color, but he did not speak English. never learned English. He was illiterate as far as I can tell. And he leads these people west in 1811. And again, they are not being forcibly removed. They are, a lot of Native Americans and the Cherokees made the decision to move simply because they knew there was game out there. There was wild game, and in the Appalachian Mountains, the game was depleting and had been for years and years. They knew there was buffalo. They had made trips, buffalo hunting, out west. They had crossed the Mississippi multiple times. He had. And so they made a decision. Like, yes, let's go. And they were offered things by the U.S. Government, none of which really came to pass. So here they are in western North Carolina, on the Wassee River. And that is just about here, where that star is. This is just such a sad story because they were told to go to an area that we now know as Missouri, to bend in the Mississippi River, just very, very southeastern edge of Missouri. And they were there for a very short period of time. I'm not even sure it was a year. And something happened, and it was the Great Earthquake. And if you've ever heard of the Great Earthquake in Missouri, it was a series of tremors, which lasted about 3 months. Some of the worst ones could be felt in Boston. There were ringing church bells in Boston. The Mississippi actually ran backwards for a while. There's a book about this Great Earthquake called When the Mississippi Ran Backwards. And everything was just destroyed. And for the Cherokees, the land had moved. I'm sure they had some crops, probably hadn't had time to develop large communities yet, but all the game was gone. Just all the game had vanished from this area of southeastern Missouri. So they kept on moving. The federal government wasn't there. They just told them to go there. So off they went. Off they went to Oklahoma. And the Osage were already there. And that's why there was this very long battle between the Osage and the Cherokees. And it gets very brutal. I don't want to, as I said at the outset, I don't think we should idealize anyone. I mean, your job as a historian is just simply to figure out what happened. And I'm not sure who starts the war between the Cherokees and the Osage. I don't know who's to blame. I know the Cherokees said it's all the Osage fault, but I'm just not convinced of that. But it was brutal. And when the federal government refused to side with the Cherokees, there was a group led by Bulls who said, okay, we're done. And they, the winter of 1819, they moved south and they crossed the Red River into Texas. And there was no one to stop them. And all of those Indian tribes who came to Texas, they just came because there was no one to stop them. The Spanish had very little presence, had no military presence at all in this region. And so, they wound up in Texas. So these are immigrant tribes. These are people who come from the United States. These are people who precede Stephen F. Austin. I can't emphasize that enough. And if you remember your Texas history, when the Mexican Republic begins, then it's Stephen F. Austin all the time. But in fact, the first American migrants to Texas are not Stephen F. Austin and the 300. It's the Alabama Cochon, it's the Cherokees and others. And the Cherokees finally find a home in East Texas. And I guess I should say, since we're in North Texas, that they wanted to come here. This is where they started, the Trinity River Basin. And they found that the Wichitas, or a subgroup of the Wichitas, were here and didn't want them, didn't want to fight over resources with them. And so these Wichitas kicked them out, and they moved to East Texas. And if you know your East Texas geography, the Angelina and the Neches River, between those two rivers, this was the Cherokee homeland. It's now Cherokee County and Smith County, okay? Up to Tyler, so north of Nacogdoches up to Tyler. And they came here in 1819 and they wanted to stay. So now I want to talk about this man, Richard Fields. And this is the best picture I have of Richard Fields. Okay? I don't like the picture of Bowles. I like this one even less. We don't have a good picture of Richard he appears to arrive a little bit after Bowles, and he had made the same trek. He started in Tennessee and moved to Oklahoma, and then came down probably in 20 or 21. But he was very different from Bowles. Think of Bowles as a traditionalist. He didn't speak English. He was, Bowles was very much a man who sort of old, believed in the old ways of Cherokee. Richard Fields is also mixed race, but he's more American, and we know that he had speculated in land. And he was something of a wheeler dealer, and had owned slaves, had owned large landholdings, but lost them in bankruptcy. At various times in his career, he's now in his 40s. And part of the book, in that first couple of chapters, I really wanted to get to know him. And fortunately, there were Moravian missionaries in Tennessee, and they had their diaries and papers were published while I was writing the book. And it turns out that Richard Fields was an interpreter for these guys. And he went with these Moravian missionaries up and down the Tennessee River, and spoke to the Cherokees, translated for them. And they liked him a lot. They said, he's not very religious, but he's a good translator. And I don't have a good quote, and so I'm just going to give you a passage from the book to read. Don't worry, there won't be much reading in my presentation. But so this is how I characterize it, and it's kind of I'm pulling from different accounts of these Moravians. Dressing according to his station in Cherokee society, he favored buckskin clothing lined with coral beads, and sported an exquisitely crafted long rifle with ornate silver mountings and inlays. As part of a bustling commercial network that connected whites and Indians on the North American frontier, he was an engaging, self-confident man who lived at the intersection of two worlds and seemed comfortable in both. And I think that kind of sums up for me who he is. He's an Indian, but he's a bit of an entrepreneur, an American entrepreneur, someone who speculates in land. And the reason he's so is because he knew in ways that Bowles did not. Remember, Bowles is about 20 years older and he's a traditionalist. Fields knew, hey, Texas is changing. The Spanish are now gone. The Mexican government is Spain, Spanish Empire collapsed in 1821. Okay, so now you have a Mexican government which became a republic in 1824. And so he said, look, we don't even know who the government is anymore. And not only that, we've also heard that people like Stephen of Austin are arriving. They had gotten, just rumors that some white men had shown up on the banks of the Sabine River. It was Moses Austin. We need to do something. We need to get title to the land that we own. And this is not an Indian idea. This was an American idea. A piece of paper that meant this is yours legally and you can stay here. Native Americans weren't often thinking in these terms. It took somebody like Richard Fields, an Americanized Indian, to say, we need this. So he writes to this, the Mexican governor in San Antonio. I've condensed this a bit, but it's written phonetically, and so I've written it in proper English. We don't really know who wrote this. If Fields wrote it, his English wasn't particularly good. But in any event, this is a handwritten note that was sent to a Spanish official, Mexican official in Nacogdoches. I wish to fall at your feet and humbly ask you what must be done with us poor Indians. Give us title to land so that we are safe and secure in this area of East Texas. We want to stay, we want to be good citizens, so give us the legal validation for what we're trying to do. If we present ourselves in a rough manner, we pray you to write us. Our intentions are good toward the government. Yours is the chief of the Cherokee Nation, Richard Fields. And so the Spanish and Mexican officials take pity on him. And he's there with about half a dozen Cherokees. Bowles is there too. And they get to San Antonio. And the governor there said, well, my hands are tied, I can't do anything. So go to Mexico City, and maybe they can help you out. Maybe they can give you a land title to the land that you're on. And he writes letters of recommendation. He said, look, these seem like really nice folks. Don't think of these as the wild Indians of the North, he writes to his officials, to Mexican officials. The Indios barbaros, the Comanches in particular, and the Wichitas and the Apaches. These are not like them. These are farmers. They want to be left in peace. They would be good Mexican citizens. Treat them right. So off they go. And they go to Mexico City. They're there in 1823. And they find Stephen Boston's there. And they find a lot of other American impresarios. And they all want the same thing. They want the Mexican government to give them a piece of paper that says, you can settle here. The Mexican government, some Mexican officials are sympathetic, but the ones in power at the time they arrive are not. And the reason they're not is because impresarios like Stephen F. Austin and Haynes Edwards, they had money, to be an impresario, to be a colonist, to bring settlers to Texas, that cost money. The Cherokees were penniless. In fact, they had to borrow money from Austin and Edwards so they could stay in Mexico City while their case was being heard. So essentially, the Mexican government gives them a bum's rush and says, look, go home. We'll get back to you. Don't come back, because they were tired of it, because after a while, the Cherokees were sort of a drain on the national treasury. And they said, look, we'll get to you later. And it was really clear from the letters that they wrote to the Cherokees, to Fields. Let's just wait and see. And then we don't know what happens. Because it goes back to Texas. Clearly, the mission had been a failure, colossal failure. And apparently, he told the Cherokees it could not have gone any better. The Mexican government has given me the authority for us to stay here. And not only that, they've given me the power to recruit more Indians from Oklahoma, the Indian lands above the river, Oklahoma, and elsewhere. Apparently, what he told the Cherokees was this had been just an amazing success. They got everything that they wanted. And it's really clear that's not what he was told. But in the following year, Indian agents in Oklahoma and settlers in Texas there are rumblings about there's something going on here in East Texas. These Native Americans are coming down the Red River, and we ask them, why are you here? And they tell us, Richard Fields has summoned us. And so he's actively recruiting peoples, Choctaws, Chickasaws, other Cherokees, Shawnees, Delawares. And we don't know why he does this. And one historian who wrote about the Cherokees many, many, many years ago took a very patronizing view. And he was like, well, these were simple children of the forest. They really didn't know what they were doing. I don't buy that argument. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. And I think what he wanted was, I'm here in East Texas, and we're all by ourselves. There are no Mexican officials here at all. Do whatever I want. We're going to bring more Native Americans from the United States, and then it'll be sort of a fait accompli. We'll be like, look, now we're here, and we want to be good Mexican citizens. We'll fight the Comanches, the Indios, barbaros, if you want. But there's really nothing we can do about that. That's what I think. Because he was too savvy, he was too Americanized to refer to him as some sort of child of nature. It just doesn't wash. That's what I think he was doing. And so then he writes this letter to the Nacogdoches officials, and I've taken them out of my talk in the interest of time, but they are hilarious. Or at least they're hilarious to me. And he said, well, I am the chief of all the Indians of East Texas, which wasn't even a thing. You couldn't be the chief of all these peoples. And he said, I've got 20 tribes here, and we want to be good citizens. We want to protect you from the Comanches. And the response of these Mexican officials in Nacogdoches and then in San Antonio, it's like, who is this guy? And they write to Mexico City, and they write to the chief of the guy who was head of foreign affairs and had a very long time, Lucas Owen. And they said, have you ever heard of some guy in East Texas who, has the authority, he claims, to recruit Indians and to create this sort of Native American pan-Indian alliance above Nacogdoches? And Lucas Owen writes back and said, yeah, sure, that was the guy who was here last year. And we told him to go away. And so, at that point, it's clear that Richard Fields is not going to get what he wants. And then entered John Hunter, who is a white man who claimed to have been kidnapped by the Indians as a child. We don't know. I think he probably was. Some people claim that he was a fraud. I'm not sure that I accept that. But he was definitely an American, had no Indian heritage at all, but had lived among the Indians in the home for quite a while. He wrote a best-selling book. And he met Thomas Jefferson, and he went to England, and he had patrons in the English monarchy, in the British royal family. And he was a celebrity. He was famous in the 1820s. And lo and behold, he shows up in Richard Fields' village. And Fields probably realized that Hunter was going to be very, very helpful. And he said, look, I'm trying to get this land title. I'm trying to get land title from the Mexican government. We'll give it to you. And Hunter, they decide, one of them decides, both of them decide, that Hunter will go down by himself and try a second time to get the Mexican government to give him the legal title. And so Hunter is down there. Again, we're talking 9 months to a year. That's how long it takes him. And he comes back, and he said, well, that did not go well. The Mexican government is not listening to us at all. There were political reasons, which I just won't go into now. None of the American impresarios wanted Cherokees in East Texas because they saw this as a very valuable timberland. And the idea that the Mexican government was just simply going to give it all away to Native Americans was a real problem for them. So they didn't get what they wanted, and it's on after Hunter returned that Fields became furious. And he writes, again, this is phonetic, so I polished it up a bit. I am a red man and a man of honor and can't be imposed in this way. We will lift up our tomahawks and fight for land with all those friendly tribes that wish land also. If I am beaten, I will resign to fate. If not, I will hold lands by the force of my red warriors. So now, Fields is no longer telling the Mexican government, we want to be good Mexican citizens. And he signs a document with Haynes, who was an impresario who owned land in that region. And they got together and they said, look, let's lead a revolt to break all of Texas away from Mexican rule. And this is the Republic of Fredonia. In the Nacogdoches, Fredonia Hotel. This is very important to the story of Nacogdoches, the history of that town. The flag is red and white to symbolize this union between Anglo-Americans and Native Americans. And it's signed by a number of people. Fields signed it, so did some of his friends. Hayden Edmonds signed it, and some of his friends. It didn't go well. They had not really thought this out too much. And it was only after they signed it that Fields started to try to drum up support among these Native American tribes for this revolt against Mexico. And then he found that they really were not that interested. And they particularly weren't interested in a revolt with Anglo-American allies. So the long and short of it was the Fredonian revolt sort of ended almost before it began. One loss of life was the end. When they signed the document, but it's over by January of 1827. And they all dispersed. The American land speculators rushed into Louisiana, and tragically, Fields and Hunter, they had dragged the Cherokees into this revolt. The Cherokees were not interested, and particularly Bowles was not interested. So there's a tribal council. What do we do with these guys? and they decide to put them both to death. So Fields is killed, he escapes, tries to get to Louisiana where he has family, but he's killed before he gets there. Hunter tries to get to Nacogdoches, where there are whites, and he has 2 Indian companions, and unbeknownst to him, they are working for Chief Bowles, assassinating him along the way. So it's a sad story. That's the end of Richard Fields. But the desire for a Cherokee homeland continues. And Bowles, although he's a traditionalist, and although he had decided that Fields and Hunter had to die, I think realized that they were onto something, that they needed title to land. So this was not the end of the Cherokees' long petition to Mexico for legal title. Okay. By the early 30s, Mexican, for reasons that I won't go into, but a very famous figure in early Texas history is Mier y Terán. He's a Mexican official who's asked to do sort of an inspection tour of Texas. And I took this out of my talk as well in the interest of time, but he has these in his diary. He's staying at an inn in Nacogdoches, and he writes to his superiors in Mexico City, one of the most annoying things about this whole business is that these Native Americans are showing up at my hotel unannounced, and they will plop down on the floor of my room, and they will smoke their pipes, and you can't breathe, and they wanted his attention. They wanted land, and they said, is the Mexican government going to give us land? You are the representative of Mexico. He wrote down back to Mexico City. I don't know what to do. I haven't been told any instructions about this whatsoever. And as time goes on, Mier y Terán rises in the Mexican highway. He ultimately he is in charge of all of Texas and northeastern Mexico. And Mier y Terán decides that, we really do need to help Native Americans in Texas. The immigrant tribes, anyway. He's not interested in the Comanches, the Indians, Barbers. But he looks at the Cherokees and he said, these could be good citizens. We need to make them good citizens of Mexico. Especially when he realizes that Mexican citizens do not want to move north and south Texas, which is what he was really supposed to do, find a way to get Mexicans to settle in Texas. Mexicans below the Rio Grande want to come. And so ultimately comes to the conclusion, look, there's a big population of Native Americans here. They want to be good citizens. Let's let them do that. And so that's when it looks like they're finally going to get it. Because the most important figure in Texas politics is Mier y Terán. Mier y Terán has decided in the summer of '32, this is going to happen. It doesn't work out. In the summer of '32, Mier y Terán, who suffered from depression, committed suicide for reasons that had a lot to do with Texas politics, but Mexican politics as well. That was in July. The following month, the commander of Nacogdoches, who was going to be the guy on the ground who would hand out these land titles to the Cherokee families, he was deposed in a revolt by the settlers, the residents of Nacogdoches. And in September, the governor of the state of Coahuila, Texas, died of yellow fever. So in 3 months, the 3 most important figures who could make a Cherokee homeland a reality, they were now gone. And so in '32, that is the end of this attempt at a Cherokee homeland from the Mexican government. But as we know, 4 years later, there was a rebellion. And at this point, Chief Bowles says, well, we clearly aren't getting any love from the Mexican government. What about this rebel? And what makes it even more attractive is Bowles, if he didn't know Houston personally, he knew of him, and he had friends who knew him well. Bowles, as I said, was from North Carolina. Houston was from Tennessee, so they may not actually have crossed paths until they both got to Texas. But Houston was a friend to the Cherokees, and everybody knew them. And so he was the general of the Texas Army, and in February of 1836, he met with Bowles, and they signed a treaty. And interestingly enough, Richard Field's son was the translator for that treaty. And the treaty says, we will give you that homeland. The land between the Neches and the Angelina Rivers, that's yours. What we would like is for you to fight with us against the Mexican government. And Bowles and the Cherokee said, well, we're not really going to do that. But we will stay out of it. And that was enough. And this Cherokee Treaty was one of the most important events in the Texas Revolution. Whoever's heard about the Alamo, who's heard about San Jacinto? If the Cherokees and the immigrant tribes had decided to go to war against Anglo rebels on the side of the Mexican government, and there were thousands of them in East Texas, not just Cherokees, but the ones that I showed you on that map, it would have been a disaster. The revolution would have ended very differently, I think. This is a big deal. Cherokee Treaty in 36 was one of Houston's major accomplishments. What Houston did not tell was that, well, there's this, when we sign treaties in the United States, they have to be ratified by the Senate. And the Senate doesn't really exist or hasn't met yet. And he kind of left that part out. So that when the ink was dry in the Cherokee Treaty in February 36, and this is, I think by this time, I forgot the exact date of the treaty, but at Santa Ana, if he's not in San Antonio, he's on his way. And in fact, I think he was already in San Antonio. They needed the Cherokees to sign this treaty. They needed him to stay out. And so they do stay out. But unless it's ratified, it's not true. And clearly, Bowles didn't realize that. Okay? Well, the Cherokees didn't, they stayed out. The Anglo-Americans won. And they had reason to be optimistic because not only have they fulfilled their part of the bargain, Sam Houston was not only general of the Texas Army, he was now president of Texas. And so it's like, how could this possibly go wrong? We have done everything we needed to do. It did not work out that way. It went to the Senate, submitted to an Indian Affairs Commission, which immediately rejected it. And not only did that happen, but a land office was created, and I don't want to get into the weeds of what that means, but the land office basically is handing out land title to settlers, what Anglo-Americans like to call the public domain. Well, you call it public domain, but there were Indians on it, and so it wasn't just this empty land. So when the land office is approved in 37, and surveyors start to move into the woodlands of East Texas the following year, there's going to be trouble. And the Cherokees, I want to make this clear, have been very peaceful. At the Center for Greater Southwestern Studies, we are doing this digital humanities project on interethnic violence. And I'm just going to make a point that I've made already, that these are not the Comanches. These people don't raid. We can't find any evidence of interethnic violence between the Angelina and the Neches rivers, unless Anglos cross those rivers and move into that homeland. In this region, this is about an hour west, an hour east of Nacogdoches. A family had moved in, they had been given land by the land office, and they said, no, we're here to stay. There's a story, I have it in the book, and I guess it's true, I hope it's true, because it's in there, that Bowles went to the settlement in person and said, you need to leave. And they didn't. And the next thing they knew was Cherokees had come into that settlement and they had wiped it out. This wasn't just a raid like a Comanche raid. Because Comanches always knew they wanted to come back and raid some more. The Kaloo massacre was a massacre. They killed all of the settlers there. And some women escaped, some children escaped. The men did not. Isaac Kaloo, who was the leader of the settlement, and there's a line, sort of in the middle of nowhere. It's actually quite hard to follow. But it's there. And the Kaloo massacre really is the pretext. There are others, but the most important pretext for the expulsion of the Cherokees. Okay? After the Kaloo massacre, there wasn't anyone in the Texas government who wanted to I think was a friend to the Indians. I mean, I think he was sincere, but he was in a difficult spot. He was president of a white republic. And I have a title of a chapter in the book, it's called I Have Never Told You a Lie, which is a letter that he wrote to Chief Bowles, and I think I say something like, I don't know if I said that wasn't his first, and it wasn't going to be his last. He did lie to the Indians repeatedly, but I don't think that he knew how he was going to help them. And so I am sympathetic to Houston. His successor, not so much, because Lamar's whole, every fiber of his being was that Indians have no place here. And these people had been here, well, they had been here a lot longer than Lamar himself, and they had been here longer than almost all Anglo-Americans. But Lamar said, no, the Indians have to go. And so, in 39, the Trail of Tears is the winter of 38-39. In the summer of 39, the Cherokees are expelled, and they are expelled brutally. Everyone thinks of the Trail of Tears as one sort of a low point in white-Indian relations. In many ways, this is worse. It's really quite brutal. They forced them out. At least in the Trail of Tears, there was an attempt to move them peacefully. It went badly awry. But in the case of the Texas Cherokees, they were forcibly expelled. And there was a battle at the Natchez River, a two-day battle, in fact, in July. And Bowles, by this time, was now in his 80s. And according to John Reagan, who later becomes a very important politician in Texas, he was a young man and was one of the aides to the commanders of the Texas militia. And he talks about Bowles that this is a heart-rending eyewitness account. He remained on the field on horseback, wearing a military hat, silk vest, and handsome sword, which had been presented to him by Houston. It was a magnificent picture of barbaric manhood, and it was very conspicuous during the whole battle. He last to leave the field and the Indians retreated. It's pretty clear at this point that Bowles had decided to make his last stand. And that's exactly what happens. He was shot, or his horse was shot first, and then he was shot. As he sat up with his face toward us, I started to do with a view to secure and surrender. At the time, my captain with a pistol in his hand ran toward him from farther down the line. We reached him at the same instant and realized what was imminent. I called the captain to shoot him, but he fired, striking Bowles in the head, killing him instantly. And so that was the end of the Cherokee quest for a permanent home. The Cherokees were expelled, as were the other tribes. There was one immigrant tribe that they did not expel, and there's a lot of confusion about that. And those were the Alabama Coushatta. I don't know if anyone's been to the Alabama Coushatta Reservation. It's in Liberty County. It's pretty remote. And if you've been to the big thick forest where the Alabama Coushatta live, then you know why they were allowed to stay. Because the forest was so dense, it wasn't suitable for commercial agriculture. In the case of the Cherokees had been tilling that land for 20 years. I mean, literally. They had cut down whole forests. They had built log cabins. They had cleared land for villages. The Alabama Coushatta didn't really live in villages. They lived in tiny little cabins just in the middle of this incredibly dense forest. And so that's the reason the Alabama Coushatta were allowed to stay. And that's why they're there now. And there's an Alabama Coushatta reservation in Liberty County. But all the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Shawnees, the Delawares, they were all expelled in 1839. And there were only remnants of them into the 1840s. So it's not a pretty story, but I think it's an important story. And when we think about the early decades of Texas, I think we need to focus not just on Stephen F. Austin, who's obviously the most important figure in shaping what we call modern Texas, early modern Texas. But he wasn't the first. He was not the first immigrant. Alabama Coushatta, Cherokees were here before he was. And that's a story that needs to be told too. So bear that in mind when you think about what you learned in Texas history. It's a complicated story, not always a pretty one, but Pueblo Indians were here. I think we have to call the Okies and the Zuni's indigenous. The Karakwas who lived on Long Coast were indigenous. Who else? The Caddos are indigenous. And so if you go on 20, and you head west, east, right, to 40 and Tyler, there's evidence of cattle mounds.
Well, there's different categories here in this area.
That's right. Well, very few of this one is.
But I guess I was having a hard time understanding. They all came from other states too.
The Caddos are indigenous. The Caddos have been here for half of my life, as far as I know. And they were called Caddos, and they were called many other things. There are indigenous peoples here. But the people that we're talking about, the Cherokees, we need to understand about any more than the Comanche or the Wiggs. They came later. But it's also hard to realize about the Caddos. There's a reason why, I told you a few minutes ago, the Cherokees initially came to this area, and they crossed paths with the Wichitas. Wichitas did not want them here. They weren't going to fight for resources. They were going to defend their homeland just like the Osage did. And so they fought fiercely, and the Cherokees headed east. And they moved into East Texas, and that's where the Caddos were. If there's a reason why they stayed, and that's because the Caddos had been so decimated by disease. Cholera first, smallpox, destroyed them. There's a theory that even bubonic plague in the late 18th century. And what the Cherokees found were Caddo villages that were abandoned. The land had been cleared, and all they needed to do was tear down the thatched homes of the Caddos and build their own cabins. So that's why they went to East Texas, because the indigenous population didn't like Caddo disease.
Now, was it our great-grandmother or our great-grandmother? Great-great-grandmother was the first black woman born in Lyston. It was all in
In Lyston,
And my mother used to tell my kids when they were little stories about how they had hid under the bed when the Indians were circling the house, and they
Right.
actually took one of the young men captive, and they had to pay $25 to be back.
well, there's
They
a lot.
a 10 shot of this kid that was supposedly killed by one kid that was carried
Yeah.
off, and then 10 years later.
We talk about that a lot in this interactive violence website that we're doing. Certainly Wise County comes up a lot. I have family in Arlington County. And that area was Comanche hunting land for a long time. Well into the 1870s, amazingly enough. Well into the 1870s. 76, the last time I was in Comanche. West of. Anything else? Okay.
Come the other titles of the books you've written, and I think you guys have for sale of this.
Yeah, so this is my fourth book. My first book was about the Bear Expedition, the Texas history of the Black Queen episode. I don't know if you've heard of that. And then I have two books on American history during this period. One was on James K. Polk, one was on the American attitudes toward the British, called the Unfinished Revolution. But this is my last one, and to be honest, this is the one that's really written for a general audience. The only people, besides academics, who read my first three books was my mother. This I wrote for a general audience. It's not an academic. Don't be concerned. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You've got them for $24.
Oh, I do have some if anybody wants to buy them for $24.
Mr. Griffin was on for 6th grade.